Okay, in this video we're going to talk a little bit about the monitor theory and cognitive theory. Our chapter 2 in our textbook presents a lot of theories about language learning. I think they're all valuable and you should study them and carefully sort of try to understand them. One of your activities this week is sort of a way to try and map those onto real concepts that you can use in the classroom or that you have been using in the classroom, sort of figure out why, how a certain activity pairs up with a certain theory. I don't think there's one definitive way or theory to teach a second language. There are people who are diehard believers in one theory over another, who reject certain premises. In the 20 years I've been teaching language, I think having the understanding the theories and having the flexibility to sort of lean on one more than another at a certain time, but be able to transition over to a different one and not be so hardened in your approach can really help you, because your classes are always going to be different. Your students are always going to be different, and we have to be adaptive to their learning needs. So my advice when it comes to theory is to be familiar with the theories, understand what they say, what they're theorizing in terms of language acquisition. But ultimately, it's your job, it's your decision in your classroom to figure out which is the best approach to take at any given time. I'm going to talk about these two theories in particular because I feel like, to me, they're the most relevant. They're the ones that I've sort of gravitated towards most consistently. Sometimes knowingly I've gravitated towards them, and sometimes I was doing things related to the theories without even knowing that I was doing it related to the theory. I was just following what I felt like were instinctively good practices. So with the monitor theory, it's this idea that we can acquire language as older learners in a similar way that we've learned theory when we were that we learned language when we were younger. Okay, it's sort of the natural approach. There's a lot of emphasis on comprehensible input, and that's a word you're going to hear me talk about, and we're going to get into a lot more in our class. It's the idea that if I use language that the learner can understand, then they're going to start acquiring that language. It's like when we're talking with our children, for example, I don't go up to my 3-year-old and start talking to him about monitor theory. I use language I think he can understand. Would you like a glass of milk? Okay, great. I will get you some milk. You need to put on your shoes. Let's not touch the light socket, right? That's how they learn words like the word for light socket, the word for touch, right? That's sort of this idea of comprehensible input. And we need to be using comprehensible input with our students as much as possible, right? As we become more mature language learners, we start to become sort of the editors of what we're producing. Meaning, in other words, we understand what it is we are producing and we can edit it. And I do this a lot with my own Spanish, because since I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but I've been teaching Spanish for so long now that if I make a mistake mid-sentence, I'll usually correct myself as long as I recognize it. And I tend to correct myself in the subjunctive quite a bit. Like, for example, with the word cuando in subjunctive. So, cuando tengo tiempo libre, me gusta leer, right? Versus, hoy cuando tengo un momento libre, voy a leer. The idea of the concept for me as a non-native is challenging, and I'll often just flip it quickly when I realize that, oh, that's not what I wanted to say. So, as I've talked about in a couple of other videos related to this lesson, the idea of I+1 is really important. It gives our students a framework to learn in manageable chunks, right? Our learners have to, under the monitor theory, they've got to be motivated. We've got to have a low effective filter for them to be able to learn. And a big one is how we correct errors in class. And we're going to talk about error correction in a lot more detail. We're going to dedicate a lot of time to that. But error correction can totally change the nature of your class. Because if you're going around correcting every single little error, you're going to produce learners that are risk averse. And we want students to take risks with the language. We want them to babble, to use language incorrectly, and we can correct it in a very in a careful way that doesn't discourage them from output, which is our goal. We want them to be giving us output, and then we can sort of work with that output, but we don't want to go around and shut down our learners because we want to make sure that everything they say is 100% perfect. Okay. One of the best ways to error correct under sort of the monitor theory is to repeat something that the student says incorrectly back to them correctly. The same way we would with a child. If a child says, "Me want a cookie," I want a cookie. You want a cookie? I want a cookie. And then the child might repeat back, "I want a cookie." It just happens naturally. That's a type of error correction we can use that's not sort of saying like, no, it's not me, it's I, because you need to use the subject pronoun, not the object pronoun. I is, and we talked about this in class. You can't correct errors like that in a second language classroom and expect students to be motivated, to have low affective filters, and to be wanting to produce output. All right, so a little about the cognitive theory. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but the basic idea of the cognitive theory is that when you're teaching when a child's learning language as an 18-month-old, well, really, children, we know that they start learning language as early as in the womb. They start developing the synapses of language. But when and they learn it up until they're in school, they start developing that linguistic framework. But once you have that framework and you get into high school, 9th grade and beyond, and even younger to a degree, but we're focusing on 9 through 12 and beyond, you have a framework already laid down. You already have a knowledge level about language learning, right? But you also have a cognitive level about learning itself. When you're taking a language class, you understand that you are taking a language class. You understand that you're being taught language. You don't understand that when you're 1 year old. You're just learning it. It's just acquiring it naturally. But older learners already have that cognitive framework built in. So that's something we have to keep in mind. And the cognitive theory says that what we need to have because of that is we've got to have some type of organizational structure. We can't just be randomly teaching stuff and letting it happen totally organically. We've got to have a structure there because we have this cognition that we are learning. And because we have this cognition that we are learning, and that we understand that learning takes place in an organized sequence, we need that type of sequence in our language classes as well. I think this is debatable. I tend to like to have a little bit of structure at the bare minimum, to have some tasks as to structure my lessons. So when I say tasks, like let's work on you being able to describe your family, right? And from there we can go to your friends. And from there we can go to maybe describe people that you don't know but you can see, right? So we can build on those structures, that organization. But I wouldn't say like, oh, right, let's talk about describing our family and then jump and say, how do we prep a meal, and then swing over to talk about your health. And I think there has to be some structure, and that's kind of what a textbook offers you. It offers you a scope and sequence, and those are the two words that are used all the time: scope and sequence. Like how much do you want to teach in a year, in a semester, in a unit, in a lesson? And the sequence is the order. So the cognitive approach is something we'll really get into when we start talking about lesson planning, because we want to have some sort of structure there to help our learners frame what it is we're doing. Okay? So that's just a little bit about the monitor theory and the cognitive theory. Again, read the theories carefully, sort of try to take notes and highlights of the main characteristics. I'm not a big proponent of theory as the driving force behind my teaching, even though if you saw my teaching you would say, oh, he's using this or that. I try to make sure that I'm employing really good teaching practices consistently that are helping my students learn. And sort of close that loop by assessing how they're learning carefully with informal in-class assessments, formal assessments, etc. And we'll talk about assessments a lot later, but never become too ingrained in a theory that you're unable to make a course correction if you see something's not working, or if you're using something that's working really well, to stick with it. So we'll be talking more about this throughout the course.